سفير وحياة. أي بس يعني الشنك الأطول بالسفير كان.
Hello everyone. Welcome to this book panel that is sponsored by Center for Arab and Middle East Studies at AUB. I'm Laleh Khalili. I'm a professor of Middle East politics at SOAS in London. And I am honored to be chairing this session. The concept of the panel, which has been, I think, invented by Center for American Studies, with Alex sitting in the back, is to introduce a book that has been recently written and bring three different people who actually have some sort of expertise or some sort of interest in that book or in some aspect of that book to comment on it. And it is truly my pleasure to be chairing this session, which is on Mona Harb and Lara Deeb's wonderful, amazing book. I'm tipping my hand early on. Leisurely Islam, Negotiating Geography and Morality in Shia South Beirut. The format is going to be, Mona is going to speak a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to introduce our two other panelists, and thereafter they'll comment on the book, and then Mona will respond, and then you guys would also engage. I will also be speaking. I think the three of us will only speak for about 7 or 10 minutes. Not too long. To quickly introduce Mona, many of you guys know her already because she is the Associate Professor of Urban Studies and Politics here at the American University in Beirut. As I said, she is the co-author of this wonderful book, but she has also written another book in French in 2010, and because my French accent is completely shit, excuse me, it's being filmed, but I'm not going to even attempt to read it, but essentially it's about Hezbollah in Beirut and about the banlieue. Now, she's at the moment, so apologies about that, she's at the moment investigating decentralization, local government, and urban development policies in the Arab world, as well as public space practices and urban politics in Beirut itself. Mona is also co-editor of Jadaliya's cities page, which I recommend you check out. It's a very vibrant website, which has lots of really interesting things about urban politics in the Arab world. So, Mona, would you like to begin?
Yeah. I should take this.
Yes.
I understand. Yeah. Thank you very much, Laleh. It's actually an honor that you're chairing the panel. We're very happy that you're here. I also want to thank CAMES for organizing this, specifically Walid Hasboun for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure and delight to be able to talk about the book at AUB. And I also want to thank Aliya Saidi for all her efforts in organizing this. I look forward to a lively discussion. Okay, so Leisurely Islam began as a series of conversations in the early 2000s between Lara Deeb and me. We mainly talked about Dahia, the area south of Beirut that you see in the dotted square here. And we had both researched and written about the political, institutional, urban, social, and religious changes that had occurred in this part of the city. We both witnessed the transformation of Dahia and its Shia community into a more middle-class and normatively pious community. We wanted to follow up on some of the ramifications of those changes. After the withdrawal of Israel from South Lebanon in 2000 and the massive destruction brought by the 2006 Israeli war on Lebanon, we began to notice the emergence of a vibrant cafe sector in the area. This led us to narrow our focus to leisure and related ideas and practices of morality and space. We wanted to show the different ways that people, including pious people, can and do enjoy themselves in different parts of the city. We also wanted to treat leisure as something that is, on the one hand, as disciplined as other aspects of life, and on the other hand, an arena for potential dissonance. As our research continued, we also began to map the networks of production of leisure in Dahia and to gain a greater understanding of the urban transformations that went hand in hand with these social changes. We refer to cafes in Dahia as sites of moral leisure. Namely, these are places that do not serve alcohol, that play soft music, and offer halal food, and that owners and patrons describe as conservative and where behavior is controlled. I will say more about how we conceptualize morality later. A small note on our methods. Our work is based primarily on collaborative fieldwork conducted between 2007 and 2009, including participant observation, surveys, and semi-structured group and individual interviews. I'd like to show you now some images of these cafes and some of the maps we produced with Ahmed Gharbiye. Moral Leisure in Dahia begins with 2 large-scale projects. This is one of them, Al-Saha Traditional Village, Mat'am al-Saha, owned by Al-Mabarrat Organization, the charitable association of the late Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, built in 2000. This is some images of its interiors. The second project is Fantasy World, an amusement park and a set of restaurants owned by Al-Inma Group, a big private real estate contracting firm operating in Dahia. Fantasy World was built in 1998. These 2 big projects are followed by dozens of medium and small-scale restaurants and cafes that multiply throughout Dahia, as you see in this map. This is prior to 2002. Sorry. This is between 2003 and 2005, and the bottom one is between 2006 and 2008. Up until 2009, when we conducted our fieldwork, there were about 100 cafes and restaurants in Dahia. I'd like to show you now some images of a small selection of the cafes we surveyed. This is Bab al-Hara, named after the famous Syrian TV series. This is a 2-floor cafe situated in a residential building in the trendy Sainte Thérèse neighborhood. It includes a gym and a hammam in the basement that attracts many people from Beirut, actually, and a cafe over 2 floors. This is the ground floor, furnished in heritage style, and the first floor, furnished in contemporary style. Other cafes are built on a large plot of land and include an outdoor garden area celebrating natural elements like Swiss thyme that you see here, and Nasamat, another one. They include indoor restaurants that look like a formal dining area. This is the one in Swiss thyme, and this is another one in Agadir. And those are the interiors of 2 small cafes youth are very fond of in Dahia. This is Koda Cafe, and this is Il Ponte. Cafes in Dahia vary according to size, functions, and price range, like you see in this map. The size of the square here varies with the number of seats. This is Al-Saha, this is Fantasy World, the 2 big ones, and this is Family House, and not a third very big one in Dahia. The additional squares you see around the main square indicate additional functions found in the cafe, like the gym or the hammam I mentioned earlier, for instance. And the darker you see the color of the square, it indicates more expensive cafes. The map also shows cafes that include Wi-Fi and prayer rooms. Additionally, cafes are clearly a middle-class phenomenon and are mainly located in the middle and upper-income neighborhoods of Dahia, like this map demonstrates. Here we overlaid the geographic distribution of the 36 cafes we surveyed onto the map of land prices and the location of Palestinian camps and informal settlements in Dahia. And you can clearly see how the cafes are located in the most expensive areas of Har Tahrik and Sainte Thérèse, which is here, and the Airport Boulevard over here, and the old one here. In the book, we ask 4 questions. How do people negotiate morality in relation to different kinds of places and geography in relation to morality? How do ideas about being moral shape people's spatial practices and urban experiences? How is the city navigated and inhabited according to varying moral conceptions? How does leisure reconfigure both moral understandings and urban geographies? We discuss these questions in 5 chapters. Chapter 1 presents the context of South Beirut, defines the Islamic milieu, and situates the moral leisure sector in relation to Hezbollah's cultural production. Chapter 2 investigates the producers of leisure. It shows how Hezbollah and Al-Mabarrat are only partially involved and how the sector is really dominated by private entrepreneurs. We also discuss here the multiple authoritative definitions of morality that engender moral and geographic complexity in people's life. Chapter 3 describes and maps the cafes and analyzes their aesthetic styles, contending they display a specific eclecticism closely associated with the transnational networks of Shia residents. The last two chapters, 4 and 5, argue that there is a productive relationship between morality and geography in relation to leisure. Moral ideas and practices related to leisure shape spatial ideas and practices related to leisure, and vice versa. I'd like to now move to discuss the ways that we use the concepts of morality and space in the book and give you some examples of how youth negotiate morality and leisure and how this affects their navigation of the city. Recently, in the anthropology of Islam, a body of scholarship has come to the foreground that focuses on piety and highlights complex understandings of desire, including the desire to live a life understood as moral. Saba Mahmoud's Politics of Piety is probably the most well-known example. She argues that women in Egypt's piety movement actively cultivate virtuous dispositions through embodied practice, and that these cultivated virtues may include submission. Our concern was not with this important work, but rather with the effects of privileging a desire for virtue over everyday life's competing motivations, which can easily include desires for other good or moral qualities that are not based on piety. When piety is taken up as the scaffolding for a more general argument about moral behavior, the possibility that Islam represents just one part of what it means to live a good life is erased, and the complexities of daily negotiations of being moral are flattened. The book is in part against that kind of flattening. For our interlocutors, being a more pious person is one goal among many, and not necessarily the dominant one at any given moment. They often incorporate piety as one aspect of their conceptions of themselves as moral persons, which suggests that piety and morality need to be considered as related aspects, but separate aspects of living a good life. In other words, not only are youth living complex lives that require negotiating different and often competing sets of values, but they also sometimes question and reinterpret the morality of various practices themselves. We use the phrase moral rubrics to help us think about three sets of ideals and values that people draw on to figure out how to live a moral life, and that they use as a source of guidance. The dominant religious rubric is based on a set of values that emerge from histories of interpretations of religious texts, reinterpretation by contemporary jurists, and innovations related to individual judgment and responsibility. The second is the social rubric, which is based on values of social obligation, propriety, hierarchy, manners, and reciprocity, values shared across Lebanese society. The third is the political sectarian rubric that stems from ideas about the differential morality of Lebanon's political sectarian communities, both in relation to judgments about difference in moral norms. Christians do drink alcohol, for example, and what they do is moral within their sect, and in relation to judgment about politics. To support the resistance of Hezbollah is a moral act. In the book, we discuss many examples that show how young people debate and negotiate these different rubrics when it comes to being in proximity to alcohol, listening to music, dancing during weddings, flirting, dressing, gendered behavior, and how they disagree on which rubric is appropriate to refer to, and how they individually interpret these rubrics and justify their social practices. I don't have time to go in actual examples, but I encourage you to buy the book when you're on your way out to read them. Okay, so the discussion of moral rubrics is built on the dialectical and relational understanding of space. We underscore how space is produced and reproduced through the power of moral, social, and political authorities, and how space is constituted through and constitutive of social relations and material social practices. Space defines categories of people, places, and practices, and generates systems of exclusion and inclusion related to classifications of good and bad behavior. We define cafes through Henri Lefebvre's spatial triad. They are conceived spaces, planned, designed, and managed by different groups of people. They are perceived spaces, geographically located and distributed with specific forms and aesthetic styles. You saw a glimpse of them in the beginning. And they are lived spaces, socially experienced by patrons, generating informal collective practices and congeniality. They operate as places that are controlled by the dominant order, and simultaneously they are negotiated and experienced through social interactions. We focus in the book on these negotiations and the everyday ways that people navigate the city according to their changing ideas about what is moral and immoral leisure. Cafes are thus investigated as places where social space has the potential to be dynamically expressed, reinterpreted, and reinvented, if only for fleeting moments. Beirut's sectarian politics have a critical effect on people's mobility. Our fieldwork shows that leisure geographies are linked to these politics and to accompanying assumptions about safety, comfort, and morality. People recognize and classify signs associated with political sectarian geographies and make choices in their spatial practices accordingly. Mobilities are further complicated by the imperfect alignment of the social and religious moral rubrics we discussed, with moral space understood in political and sectarian terms. Beirut appears as a rich urban laboratory that reveals how ideas about morality and geography intersect and operate in relation to one another. The book argues that morality in its three rubrics must be added to the now classic variables of gender, class, age, ethnicity, sect, and politics that mediate and regulate spatial production. We also show that new moral leisure geographies are changing pious people's spatial experiences, both within Dahiya and between Dahiya and Beirut. Our interviews indicate how some people are more comfortable remaining within their own neighborhoods, staying inside, Jua, and this preference, of course, confines and territorially limits their spatial and leisure experiences. Other interlocutors said that they prefer to venture outside the familiar, to go barra and search for city spaces that share their moral norms. For these people, especially the young ones, new moral leisure geographies provide opportunities to navigate and experience the city through leisure and to develop new sets of urban competences. Some of our interlocutors even claim a right to the city that accommodates their desires for moral leisure and desires for leisure that conform to their moral needs. People develop hence their own moral leisure maps in ways that fit their evolving social, religious, and political sectarian moral rubrics. As in moral norms, there's a great deal of variation in pious people's spatial practices and lived spaces, and other variables come in to explain such variations, variables related to gender, age, class, education, place, and time. In conclusion, leisurely Islam shows how moral leisure facilitates new urban experiences both in Dahiya and Beirut by promoting street life and public interactions. The city is being reshaped by the spatial practices and urban experiences of youth living moral leisure. Additionally, there's a productive relationship between morality and geography that works to shape both sets of ideas and practices. Ideas about religious, social, and political sectarian moral rubrics significantly shape and are shaped by conceptions, perceptions, and experiences of space. In 2012, when we finalized the manuscript, Lara and I argued that despite the stigmatization that dominates people's perception of one another and their associated territories, the relationship between Beirut and Dahiya may become more permeable due to spatial practices related to moral leisure. However, since the war in Syria, these fragile connections seem to have dissolved, and Dahiya is on its way to reverting to a relatively isolated island unto itself. Whether the moment of connection and possibility we captured in leisurely Islam will return or not is an open question at this point. If it does not, however, Dahiya's isolation will likely lead to an even greater emphasis on developing self-sufficiency for its residents, including in the realm of leisure, following patterns we describe in our book. Thank you.
Our first commenter is going to be Jean-Baptiste Pesquet, who is a PhD student. Did I mispronounce your name? I was just earlier saying. You can reintroduce yourself. I'm really sorry about that. Okay. As a PhD student in political science and anthropology at Paris 5, and currently a fellow at IFPO in Beirut. He conducts field research with Syrian refugees in Lebanon, where he focuses on the spiritual and existential dimensions of individual political commitment. After studying at Saint Joseph, he graduated from University of Montreal and earned an MSc from University of Edinburgh, very multi-continental. His master's thesis addresses Hezbollah in light of the Foucauldian concept of governmentality, and his current research interest is Islam and secularism in liberal societies. So would you like to speak for about 7 to 10 minutes?
7 to 10 minutes. Thanks. Thank you for inviting me. Everybody? No, it's not. Maybe this one. Yeah.
Yay.
This one for the video, I think.
Yes.
Okay. Is it okay this way? Okay. So thank you for inviting me first of all, because despite my late arrival, I'm quite happy to finally be here, and I will play maybe the PhD student. So I'm not really expert in Shia and Dahiye in general, but I will be more like a kind of interest, so as was mentioned in my master thesis. My comments are quite simple. Like, first of all, I have to say that this book is really comprehensive, like really accessible, and it's a good synthesis. And I would say like most of the PhD students here are discovered and are approached the Dahiye phenomena through Lara Dib and Mona Harb. So for me, this kind of book is already a reference, because it gives me access to kind of fieldwork that I'm still not able to do, but gives me also clues to understand how it works. The first thing I want to say that the accessibility is really, for me, important in the fact also that it's coming from the geographical discipline, which is most of the time underrepresented in the university academic field, especially maybe in the more Anglo-Saxon system, and that's why I'm very happy that Monhar managed to make this bridge between this discipline, which is, I would say, very French, but happily not only. And so I would say that for me, like basically geography is about population and space. This book is about one space, Dahiye, and about one population, which is the Shia population. And my comment, because I will be very short, my comment is that you decided to focus on the pious Shia Muslims. And I would say that the main criteria of this book is this space, which is the Dahiye. And my concern is about what about the Shia Muslims that are non-pious, and what about the Palestinians, which are at least as much old in this area than the Shia themselves. So the thing for me, what is interesting about this comment about, because it's more a question, is also that, and that's my Foucauldian approach, like it's interesting to take the perspective of the minority in order to understand the perception of the minority, and what is the majority telling you, and what is the majority defining, so that it makes you a minority. And in this study, we're having the point of view of the majority. If we restricted our perspective to the Dahiye, we have the point of view of the Shia Muslim, which are pious, which is of course interesting, but also maybe it's a bit limited in the fact that it's not addressing special issues, especially regarding to leisure and morality. What I want to say that is because, for example, in this book we're talking a bit about the malls, especially the Beirut malls, and malls are, I think, and it's a bit addressed in the book, are a place of mixity in terms of population, but also in terms of relation to religion. And it's a bit addressed when you're talking about money, how the cashier are made, how do you separate money that's coming from people who are pious and people who are not. And typically this kind of place, I think, of course you had to make choices, and of course we cannot do everything, but I think those kind of places are very interesting because they're also revealing how different relationship to religion have to deal with, have to bargain regarding leisure and morality. The second thing is also that you know that there is in Dahiye a long tradition of leftist Shia or Palestinians. And those leftists are coming with a more, I would say, secular, if this term could exist and be defined, secular perspective. And this is also, I think, creating interaction in Dahye, within Dahye, because it's also, those people are not always coming to the same place than others, and sometimes they are, or at least they're living in the same place, and they're having I'm quite sure, but they're having different leisures. And those kind of leisures also creating, I think, interaction with those pious Shia Muslims. So that's the second point, like Moors for the first part. The second part is about those secular perspectives in Dahye. So what is interesting for me is that those interactions are creating, I would say, frictions. It's creating, I would say, also friction on a religious point of view, on a political point of view, and also maybe on a communitarian point of view, because Palestinians, of course, are mostly Sunnis, so it's also a question of variety. So basically, what is interesting for me in this comment is to see that you choose a definitely interesting place, but maybe we reduced a bit the variety of the population.
Thank you very much. Would you mind if everybody gave their comments, and then you can give a response? Okay. Our next commenter is Rasha Al-Atrash, who is a journalist, commentator, and novelist. She's 17 years of journalistic experience in the field and editorial work as well. She's done lots of investigative reporting, features, regular opinion, analytic commentaries, mainly in politics, media, critique, and culture. Previously, she worked as an editor at As-Safir and at An-Nahar, and now she's a manager. Sorry, Al-Hayat, not An-Nahar. Apologies. And you would think I'd be able to read.
It's right from your French is great.
And my English is problematic there. And now is the managing editor of Al-Mudun e-newspaper. She holds a Bachelor of Science from AUB and a Master's in Cultural Studies from Goldsmiths. She's also the author of a novel called Salboon. So would you like to speak for 7 to 10 minutes?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. First of all, I would like to say that I tremendously enjoyed reading this book. Although I am familiar with quite a chunk of what it tackles, especially the background and fabric that constitutes Dahye as a community under the influence of Hezbollah, I still found it enlightening on changes, youthful, vibrant changes probably undergone right under our noses as Lebanese without us really acknowledging their significance. More so, changes from the everyday culture perspective, and above all from the angle of leisure as a practice and a relatively new business investment. That was a highly needed and enjoyably interesting perspective. Here we see leisure as a pillar of the greater towering monument of life as a whole, lived by people with desires and needs that surpass words like resistance, martyrdom, power, and Lebanon's notorious sectarian struggle. It's life in Beirut's southern suburb, which for too long has been dealt with by many of us, and sometimes even by its own dwellers, solely as a political military bloc. So, here's leisure as a pillar of that bigger monument with desires and self-expression in relation to politics and religion, in addition to popular culture and individualism. It's Dahye as a space for negotiation, for youth's interaction with public and private spheres, the Dahye of borders, physical and emotional, of apparent and non-apparent dynamics among the community and between genders. While reading, I found myself wondering how all these negotiations would have taken place in a better Beirut than the one we live in today, in a relaxed, peaceful, multi-sectarian context. But then again, one would think that if there weren't a real need for that kind of Dahye leisure, by the simple supply and demand formula, a leisure very different from Gemmayzeh or Hamra, it wouldn't have flourished, whether through Hezbollah members or their affiliates or supporters. In general, I like the assessment of urban effect on a conservative, strongly ideological, initially rural society like that of Hezbollah's Dahye. For our chances of seeing that turnaround negotiation of individuality and the becoming more flexible personal freedom are far less in Nabatiyeh, for example, where Amal movement's authority prevails, and here I open brackets to say, although Amal is known to be less pious, but no less conservative or conscious of a sectarian identity than Hezbollah. And the same lesser chance goes for the rest of South Lebanon and Bekaa area, where Hezbollah is authority minus the urban influence. I like the idea of Lara Deeb and Mona Harb resourcefully and seriously playing around with the physical or symbolic consciousness of space, even while dealing with loose terms like al-hala al-islamiyya, al-bi'a al-islamiyya, al-jaw, al-iltizam, and translating all of that into tangible human experiences, respecting space with a capital S as an actual place for social/community-specific conduct and variability. Having said that, I could now move to some points that have attracted my attention and I think could be launchers of discussion, at least in terms of questions. In chapter 2, I believe, there is a very interesting passage talking about 3 types of major players in producing and controlling Dahi's leisure sites: political, religious, and economic. Key representatives of these factors feel responsible for ensuring that their customers abide by particular moral forms, as the book says. And it is said in this chapter that these efforts to produce and control leisure have created a situation of multiplicity, a myriad of possibilities for hanging out in South Beirut rather than a uniform leisure landscape. Well, this was one of the times when I felt that the researcher's conclusion bended towards the rosy interpretation, which is not necessarily faulty, but I guess also not necessarily the only right conclusion. I want to hear about the following. This multiplicity within an urban Hezbollah community, this flexibility in bending morals and piety and iltizam, in Luna parks, in cafes modernly furnished or with Eastern heritage decor, boys and girls redefining intimacy, and parents feeling okay about their teenage children going out alone to supposedly halal-abiding, well-supervised restaurants and cafes. Doesn't all of this also mean a hegemony of Hezbollah's religious, political, and social values? That it is actually spreading its representations of leisure over a supposedly colorful, diversified spectrum? The book tells us about video games titled Special Forces and a paintball facility by the same name. Could this fact, for example, mean that when Hezbollah is re-owning technology and leisure, it is further integrating its ideology in the fabric of everyday life, maybe now in a more popular and appealing way? Abu Sa'id al-Khansa in the book does talk about a responsibility of quote-unquote directing society. I am not saying that this is necessarily a planned result, but isn't it really one of the results? Isn't this what hegemony is all about? Haven't we volumes of literature, for example, about how consumerism spreads the illusion of choice while actually just pushing us towards the one function, being globalized consumers? In Leisurely Islam, we read about the broadness of different religious marja, rules for what's right or acceptable and what's not. We also read about the multiplicity of goods to consume in Dahi leisure sites, American and non-American, as well as the versatile media outlets, TV, internet, smartphones, etc. The authors subtly hint to us, probably rightly so, that Hezbollah cannot exert control on all of that, though Hezbollah officials and affiliates like to think they do. But doesn't this laissez-faire of leisure culture make Hezbollah's ideology more rooted in Dahi, exactly because its dwellers feel that they have uncontrolled or loosely controlled choices? Most of Dahi's conforming youth, as it seems, do not have to look for leisure options outside that somewhat protected comfort zone. Doesn't this actually reinforce or reward some kind of social and therefore political, cultural, and psychological isolation from the rest of Beirut? I say that while bearing in mind that areas like Tariq Jdidi, for example, is also experiencing the same mechanism of isolation, though maybe in different ways and forms. Beirut, as a supposedly urban melting pot, should, by means of its very urban dynamics, ensure interaction among city dwellers. But the truth is that the whole city is changing and not only Dahi. Thus, I thought that problematic issue was overlooked a little bit in the author's analysis of interviews and data. Going back to the issue of hegemony, I guess it could be tackled from an opposite angle. Does this Dahi-style leisure, this relatively new rising middle class, nibble little by little at Hezbollah's dominant ideology, maybe to change it from the inside and promote its distinct values? I guess that brings us back to a theory mentioned in the book about ethnicity being deeply classed. I believe ethnicity, which could very well be the religious sect in the Lebanese context, is not the one deeply classed. Rather, class in Lebanon is deeply sectarianized/ethnicized. And that might explain, for example, why the Lebanese proletariat from different religious sects and in different historical moments never united for their own class's benefit in the face of the Lebanese politico-economic system. Second observation. The book talks about the rise of a Shiite middle class associated with long-awaited peace after liberation of the South, as well as the effect of urban life and returning expatriates with some capital. The authors hint at leisure investors tending to cut deals with local de facto authorities like Amal Movement and Hezbollah to buy land on which leisure sites rose. There's also a quick mention of the Salah Izz-ad-Din scandal to shed some light on capital accumulation in Dahi. But there's also the parallel economy resulting from Iranian money flux, which was not really mentioned. There's Hezbollah itself as a direct employer too, as an institution or umbrella for numerous institutions tending to education, health, martyrs' families, etc. These institutions secure needs that with time enforced and broadened that middle class. Many Lebanese Shias have secured some source of class upgrade as employees in one of Hezbollah's institutions or as full-timers in the party itself. We call it tafarrugh. I expected this important side of economic affluence to materialize better in the book, especially that it is one of the vital factors further binding people to Hezbollah. People in the book talk about feeling safe and eligible for entertainment after the year 2000. I found that especially interesting and a little sad, actually. The war for them did not end in 1989 or 90 when Ta'if agreement was accorded, and not even in 1992 after there was ceasefire all over Lebanon. I felt this to be such a touching and realistic way of portraying how the Lebanese in many ways do not share the same view to their common history. And speaking of safety, and you talked a little bit about that, I think it would be interesting now to see if the leisure industry is still taking off after several terrorist brutal blasts in Dahi, and at a time when everyday young men come back from Syria in coffins while posters carrying their faces fill the walls around Dahi and other Shiite areas. Does this take Dahi back to its pre-year 2000 era? My guess is that leisure, once launched as an industry and being part of the daily life, it does not stop. Like Hamra Street before the Civil War, during and after the war, and up to this day. Leisure changes forms, could change location, clientele, and style, but never stops. One last observation, or maybe a prospect question. I found it very interesting, the portrayal of generation changes, like the vanguards versus the younger generation, especially with the rise of those who were in the year 2000 between the age of 18 and 30. I know the book was finished before the Arab uprisings, but I do wonder now about young men now at the age like 18 to 25 years of age who plead with their parents, and we hear about that every day, to let them go to fight in Syria with Hezbollah, allegedly to defend the sacred maqams, while this wish actually refers to the unvoiced rhetoric for defending the existence of a minority in the region. How do these youth see piety, leisure, and social morality now? Are they attested by peers? Could the internal negotiation of morality and values pass from the zone of older vanguards versus a younger urban generation to a zone among members of the same generation, peers who might have varying views of their lives, duties, and rights? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and I'm the last commenter myself. And the reason that I was chosen instead of reading a bio is because I've actually just wrapped up a research project on how Palestinians in the camp have fun. And specifically going to women-only beaches, to different kinds of cafes, and they're not necessarily staying in the dahia. So, and also I've been looking, probably because this is what I've been doing for 15 years, I've also been looking at leisure in Hamra, in the village of Hamra, in lefty bars and cafes. So I'm actually looking at the same subject, but for completely different populations. So. The questions that I have, in some ways, address this particular interest of mine. Now, I'm going to go on ahead and read from here on. Leisurely Islam follows up the iconoclastic previous works of both authors, Mona Harb and Laura Deeb, by yet again defeating vacuous cliches about life and practices of politics in Beirut. There's much to love about the book, but I shall focus on a theme which has been a research interest of mine for the last couple of years. This theme is the theme of pleasure or of fun. The book is fantastic in telling us how the youth in Dahia have fun, interact, and socialize, but perhaps more innovatively, how these ideas of leisure, pleasure, and fun are embedded in ideas about propriety, morality, and communal belonging. What is wonderful about the book is that it does not have a single-minded focus on trying to categorize fun as one thing or another, either as a sign of neoliberal frivolity or as a sign of resistance, as it has been done in other contexts. Rather, what Dieb and Harb do is to beautifully contextualize the moments which determine when fun is indeed a way of being embedded in networks of power, while at other times being indeed in a way in which to try and grasp some semblance of autonomy from modes of control, whether familial, neighborly, communal, or political. Their insistence on locating fun in the context of propriety also shows us the extent to which the subjectivities of the youth they study are in constant transformation via ethical work, via notions of propriety, and via constraints of local norms and global demands, for example, to conform to new modalities of consumerism. That they have to learn how to have fun in particular ways also points to all the complex ways in which fun is not simply the essential or natural alternative to labor or to seriousness. And your concept of flexible morality shows the extent to which the broader pressures of sociability and consumption influence the universe of restrictions, whether it's imposed on them by themselves or by others, on their behavior, on listening to music, and on homo or heterosociality. This flexibility is constantly negotiated with families and within groups, and obviously is more available to men than it is to women. Now, I think my minor question really is about class. Class seems to be crucial to this argument, and of course it appears as a background here. In fact, in your presentation, the first thing that you mention is these are leisure practices of the middle classes. But the question, and I'm entirely persuaded that the stereotypes of the Dahiya as a kind of a slum are cliches that are completely out of date. But what I wanted to know more about are variations in class consumption within these communities. Because although these places emerge as a result of an emergence of a middle class in the Dahiya, there are surely other people who are partaking of these leisure activities, number one. And number two, surely these middle class forms of consumption and leisure result in frictions between different social classes within the Dahiya itself. So I wanted to know more about this. As it stands, discussions of class are very brief and appear at the very beginning and at the very end of the book. You have a lovely Bourdieu-esque description of taste in chapter 6, and at the end of chapter 5, you briefly touch on the emergent hierarchies of class, and you tantalizingly hint at how these emergent stratifications are, quote unquote, altering urban dynamics in the process. An all too brief discussion of how the cafes are effectively gentrifying the Dahiya is also absolutely fascinating, and I wanted to know more about that. So, based on this, I'd like to ask you two questions. The first and substantive one has precisely to do with class and pleasure and fun. Can you speak a bit more about the ways in which social class may structure notions of propriety, or gendered fun and interaction, or the practices of pleasure, and it may affect those frictions, as I mentioned, between different social classes? The second question is much more mundane, and it is actually a particular interest of myself and probably the other academics in the group, which is that writing scholarly and literary texts is often a very solitary work. And when you actually collaborate, it tends to be extremely fractious and full of friction. So, and still, despite that, this book is beautifully coherent and consistent. Although I know both of your works and I've read everything, I couldn't pick out your voices, actually, which is also quite interesting. So the more mundane question is about the mechanics of co-authorship. And in terms of finding a middle ground where there may have been differences in approach, in disciplinary methods, and also in politics. I'm sure that you guys weren't 100% in agreement over everything. So if you could speak a little bit about that, I'd be interested to hear. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for amazing questions, for having really engaged with our work. This is really beautiful. I'm not sure I'm going to do justice to all the questions. I need some time to process some of the more, I would say, substantive ones, but I'll try to do my best. Okay. So I'll start more with the, let's say, what will I start with? Let me start with the beginning with the question of Jean-François. Okay.
Jean-Baptiste.
Jean-Baptiste, excuse me. No, I mean, it's pretty different, sorry. Yes, actually, I thought we sort of answered that question in the book, but I guess we were not very clear about it since you're asking it again. But our attempt to say that pious people are flexible in their interpretation of morality and geography was sort of opening up to the fact that there are non-pious people with whom they could interact. Now, in our interviews, because of I think, the way we approach the whole issue of moral leisure, and we define it as being leisure that is confined within the framework of iltizam, of piety, our respondents were very quick to define themselves as multazimin. Although in the discussions, we quickly found out there are variations in their iltizam and their piety. And this is why in the book we call them more or less pious people, because they're not, it's not like a clear category with boundaries. Some of them bring voices of leftists, secular people, friends of them, family members that contest their behavior or that force them to behave differently. So you're right in the sense that this is not a main focus in the book, but I would say the other minority groups, if there are minority, we're not sure really what do they represent, the non-pious people in Dahia, appear, I would say, in the background. But I agree with you that it would have been really interesting, and if there would be any sequel to this work, it would be to make the voices of the non-pious clearer.
Meaning that, sorry, I'm interrupting. Bringing the voice, may I?
This is an old box. This is an old box. I broke from the code, sorry.
Would you mind waiting until
about malls, there are not so many of them in Dahia. We were very tempted to work on Beirut Mall when we were doing our field work, and we surveyed some of the places inside, but we felt that it was an exceptional place as such and chose to leave it out of our survey. We felt that the cafes and the restaurants themselves represent something different. Malls we're opening up a different chapter, I would say. And given that there was only the Beirut Mall at the time, at least of our field work, but even after that, I don't think there were any malls built in Dahia. But yes, I agree with you. That would be really interesting to explore, and especially given its location. The location of the places that are on the border of Dahia, on the Damascus Street, and on Saint Therese, and their proximity to Christian neighborhoods were very interesting to us geographically. And this is something I think that is worth investigating further to tease out these frictions that you're talking about and to show how things might be changing through this. Okay, Rasha, thank you very much for all the very generous words, really appreciated. Now, the questions you ask, if this is consolidating Hezbollah hegemony, or is it diluting it? This is a question that was with us from day one. Like when we saw that phenomena, we were always like, so what is it doing? Are they co-opting the whole thing? Is it just like normalizing pious leisure and hence, disciplining and controlling, or are there ways? Our conclusions were more that it's doing both, that it is controlling and disciplining, but there are also openings happening. And these openings, we're not claiming that they are permanent or that they are enduring in their effects, but there are moments that we captured which show us that there are opportunities where the moral order, the moral authorities are being challenged and questioned. And for us, this was very interesting. Now, you are right. I think we were very conscious, and we wanted to highlight this maybe too much. So it came out maybe stronger than the hegemony narrative.
Possibility, yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's because of our previous work, where in our previous work it was very much about the hegemony, and it's, you know, they're very strong, and we wanted to sort of show that there's also other things happening, and that especially the generational changes for us were possibilities of change that we wanted to underscore. But I think at some point we also showed that it might be very closed off. I don't know, but maybe the hope came stronger. I don't know.
If I can interrupt,
Yeah.
I have heard people read this book as saying that it completely shores up the hegemony, and I've heard people read this book as saying, I've already talked to lots of people about
Okay.
it, who say that it's completely a sign that Hezbollah's hegemony is waning. So obviously people are reading this book, which is actually quite interesting, because it means the evidence is presented and people are making a judgment on the basis of how they read the situation. So, so I've heard both things.
Okay.
That's good.
Yeah,
I think it's good.
it's good, but also it means there's no answer.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, now your point about class and sect is very interesting, but I wouldn't be able to engage with it right now, and it maybe when I try to answer Lale later on this. Now, leisure today, and with everything that's happening in Syria, and the terrorist attacks that are happening very close to the cafes we've studied, I don't know. I've turned the page on all this, my previous work on Hezbollah and the Shia community, and I'm not even going back to Dahya. And I think I need distance, and given given Hezbollah's involvement in Syria and my my inability to engage even with that, whenever I get calls from journalists, I tell them I'm not working on this anymore. I'm not working on this anymore. Go speak to Joseph Al-Akha.
You can resign now, not now, Mona.
I send them to Joseph or Amal or people who are still working on Hizb. So I really don't know how to answer that and what's happening. But I agree with your conclusion that there's a new sector that got established in Dahya. And it's
Lifestyle, frame of mind.
it might slow down, but it's not going away. And I think people will still go out to have coffee, to see their friends, to meet family. But probably the interactions with Beirut are much less than what we saw before. And this is where, you know, we really see the entrenchment that we mentioned in the book. And we're much closer now to Dahya being much more of perceived as a ghetto, as a stronghold. I mean, we read about it as such, and putting all this in quotation marks, etc. So, yeah, I think I agree with that conclusion that you had. Lali, thank you also to your very, very kind words and reviews. Your question about class. I think this is something we struggled with a lot, and it relates a little bit to your comment too, Rasha, to demonstrating that there is a middle class even in Dahya. And the closest we got to that, because there is no access really to numbers or quantitative data, was through that map I showed about the land prices, in which we tried to overlay the land prices to the location, to the geographic locations of the cafes here. No, this one. So this was the closest we got to demonstrate, really, that this is a middle-class phenomena.
But it's quite interesting, isn't it, that the places with the highest land prices are the ones that are also either closer to the Christian communities or on the border, or are they?
Not necessarily. This is close to the Christian community.
Yeah, but there's that middle of the bit. In the
This one is Har Tahrik, which
Yeah.
which has a zoning law which is different than the rest of Dahya, so it might explain why also
Land
land
prices.
prices are different, and it's a place in Dahya that is considered more or less posh, but also because land prices are more expensive, and the highway and Bir Hassan, this area that you see here,
Even more push.
this is even more posh. So but because it's on a highway, it's not very attractive for cafes and restaurants. So they mostly go in the heart. But there, you notice that in Burj Brajne, in Mreiji, in the real villages, the Dahya Asliya, as my parents would call it, there are no cafes and restaurants as such, and I thought that was also interesting. Now, the frictions, we had some data in our interviews about people who looked at this phenomena as not representing them, and some guys who would say that we don't like going to these cafes, these are too posh for us, it doesn't relate relate to our morality and our moral understanding or our religious understanding, and we prefer to go to the little Sha'bi cafe under the bridge. But there were very few voices, and they were coming from the older generation, the vanguard generation. Again, if there would be any follow-up to this book, it would be to investigate more these differences and to research more about how is it affecting the built environment in terms of gentrification. If the cafes are raising prices in terms of apartments, are they marking a neighborhood as more interesting for a certain group of people, or are people leaving because of these cafes? Again, it was happening as we were surveying these places, and we decided to stop and just write. So I think there's a lot of questions that remain unanswered, and in that way, I would really invite more research to be done on this. We weren't able to cover everything.
Co-authorship.
Co-authorship. It's interesting. This is the second time I'm getting this question. We talk about it a little bit in the preface. We never really planned to write this book. We started with co-authoring an article, Lara and me, and it worked very nicely. And then we found an opportunity to apply for a collaborative grant, and we wrote the collaborative grant very, very quickly, and we won it. And we're like, oh, okay, now we have to do the work. And we formed a team of research assistants, and we started having more data, and we wrote more articles. And then one time, Lara said, Mona, we have to write a book. We have a lot of material on this. Let's write a book. And we learned to work with each other, and I would say that it was exceptionally smooth.
Really?
Because
How did you negotiate this agreement?
In a very friendly manner, over Skype, I don't know, over Skype, in the cafes, we developed a friendship along the way, so I think it was pretty exceptional. I don't think it works a lot, because I tried to co-author with other people too. It didn't work as smoothly, and we never co-authored again. So I guess, I guess in that particular way, when now we're preparing a presentation, we're giving together in a couple of weeks at Harvard, and we're like, we're working together again, and we miss it, and you feel like we're eager to do it. And she called upon me to co-author another chapter in another book. So I would say that this was exceptionally good. The way we did it practically, if we want to give practical tools, the whole book is co-authored except for chapters 4 and 5. 4 is completely written by Lara, and 5 is completely written by me. And so we finished the first draft, we sent it to each other, we gave comments, we revised it I think there were 2 or 3 rounds of this. Mm-hmm. The other chapters would be, each one, we decided that, I would start chapter 3, she would start, let's say, chapter 1, and she would start it, and then she would write, and then we said, Mona would continue on this and this. Or I don't know what to say anymore, Mona will fill in here. And then, I would go in, and I would continue. And it helped a lot that we have the same writing style. We're both people who are very descriptive, anthropological, I would say.
I could tell chapter 5 was more yours than hers, but otherwise your voices were not at all
distinct. I think
it's
interesting that our writing styles are not very different, so you don't hear 2 voices. We never, sometimes I can't remember who wrote that particular paragraph, and we get lost with that. So except for chapter 4 and 5, where we're very clear that she's an author, I'm an author, there are others, I would say, blend in, and we tend to forget who wrote what, because we really co-write them. So that was a great experience, and I would say that I learned a lot from co-authorship. I really encourage people to do it if they find a great partner. That would be great.
Okay, thank you very much,
Thank
Mona.
you. Thank you.
Shall we open the floor to questions? And since this, would you mind introducing yourself also?
Good idea. There's a Thank you very much. First of all, I'm honored to be here, and it's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to introducing myself, not only to make the comments, but to please, if I could co-author with you, I'd be more than happy. I've got material that you won't believe. And in any way, I can answer some of the questions you were mentioning about not wanting to delve into the subject ever again. I'll tell you why, because I've suffered from the same point. I'm an author and a political scientist myself. My name is Wafa Jismani. My master's degree was from McGill University. I finished in 2003, harassed by the Israelis, not by choice. God forbid if I were ever to commit any erratic political behavior and choose to disturb the political stability there. They chose to consider me as somewhat of an Arab that seems to be threatening the political stability that we've reached and the plateau that has now been obtained through the Zionist agenda in the region. And I'm not speaking lightly when I'm saying Zionist. We're all fed up with this saturation of being indoctrinated through our own local media by that agenda and what that may entail.
I'm really sorry, would you mind asking your question?
Absolutely, but the point is I came to be more or less harassed because I said something once through my MA thesis that led to my having to flee Canada and ending up in Lebanon and having the Israelis choose to try to assassinate me here instead of there, because they're civilized over there and I'm not allowed to be killed in a civilized country. That would draw lots of questions, but here everybody gets killed. So, my professor agrees. The point that I'm trying to raise right now is the reason why you don't want to research this subject anymore is because, one, when you say Hezbollah today, you are speaking of the lack of political integrity that you are allowed as an Arab and as a Lebanese. When you say the term Hezbollah, you are now establishing a term that by definition in media is considered a terrorist organization, not because it is so, but because the US considers it so. So that would mean you're falling into a pitfall, a political pitfall, by trying to fight the US. There's nothing you can say that will change their mind, even though you might be researching something so benign and so, in terms of detail, it is on the lowest form in the whole hierarchy of what Hezbollah may entail. But still, once you approach that subject, by definition, you are daring to tip the balance of what the US wants.
I'm really sorry to do this, but please ask your question.
I am asking right now. If you don't mind, just give me 5 more minutes and I'll...
No, I can't.
One more
There's
minute.
lots of people who want to ask questions.
We can
Okay.
talk afterwards.
All right,
Okay.
okay, guaranteed.
Yes, sure.
Forgive me, I didn't mean to go into detail. The point is the following. When we speak... I apologize if I've taken too much time. I didn't know how much time we had to start with.
Because there are lots of people who want to ask questions, so we just want there to be more engagement.
I thought that there was a time limit. I wasn't given any time limit. I apologize. My point is the following. When we speak of Hezbollah, we speak of Islam. When we speak of Islam, we're now talking about 2 subjects that are under direct assault. Leisure may not be a threatening aspect, but once you put Islam and leisure in one sentence, by definition, you're opening the subject through the Islam definition, and it's not going to be taken within the leisure perspective. So be it pious or not pious in Dhahir, pious or non-pious, forgive me, in Dhahir, is irrelevant since the subject is Islam and not leisure. Had you spoken of leisure alone, the point would be what it is. Given what I've said, my question is the following. Do you know anything, and I'm going to ask this in order to be able to finish this quickly. Do you know anything about Hezbollah's current struggle vis-à-vis the changes that have occurred in the region within the Arab-Israeli, then you have just...
It's not the topic of this book.
I have no... That's not my question. The point is, once you put Islam and leisure in the title, you have established an Islamic perspective to the subject, which allows the US to use against...
Okay,
really is.
thank you. But I think she mentioned that it's about the subject of the book is about leisure and the ways in which the people were engaging in it.
I have no doubt. My final point, if I may, my final point is, when you speak of Dahya, you're speaking of an isolated island because it is in a battle that Lebanon is facing in general, and not because of Islam. Lebanon is facing a classified struggle which we are not allowed to know of for specific political reasons. So leisure within that context, and I beg all your forgiveness if I have in any way
Yes, you did.
imposed, I apologize.
Can we move to another question?
Yes, can we please have the... Please.
Okay, I have some very mundane questions.
Thank you.
Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, I'm Judith Perry. I was a professor at AUB for many years and have a book on Hezbollah and so on, and Mona is one of my favorite people, and erudite people. I admire her work very, very much. And I haven't had the chance to read the book yet. So what I want to know is a little more about the methodology. Yeah, you did mention that you did a survey, or some surveys. Okay, was that the kind of handout, the questionnaire type of thing? Okay, and can you tell us how many people you surveyed? And what was the breakdown between men and women? And how did you measure piety? And how did you measure morality? What questions did you ask these people that would allow you to code them either very moral, less moral, etc.? Was there a difference between the men and women who answered? That's a lot, and I kind of apologize for that, but it's very interesting to me. Thank you.
How about if I take that, please? Thank you. Sorry about that.
Shall we take the
Yes, please. Can you?
Or do you want me?
Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I'd like to collect a few. Yeah, I'm taking notes, don't worry.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you along the same line. Did you ask them whether they want to stay in cafes locally because it's too far to go out? And whether, had they been given, because I'm a physician, and when I refer patients outside Dahi, they say, can this physician, does he have a day where he come here? Because going to Hamra or to AUB is too far. So we established relationships like that. Second, do they have a difference? Are they okay going to Hamra versus going to Solidar? Because my parents live in Dahi and they feel they're conservative and they feel better in Hamra, more at home, and they feel very strange in Solidar and downtown where they feel the hegemony of the other side political arena. So did you ask these two questions?
Would you like to answer these questions now?
Yeah, sure. I can do that. Well, for a few words about the methodology. We did the survey, not like the surveys you do. So it was a survey about 400 plus customers. We distributed like index cards in the cafes and they had to fill them. It was more socioeconomic background about the patrons, trying to profile who goes to which places. And the results are all in the book detailed. The cafes are patronized equally by women and men. That there's no major difference. It's very mixed in terms of gender use. So that was a major finding that makes Lebanon quite different from Egypt, for instance, where gender segregation is much stronger. And how did we conceptualize piety and morality? We asked questions about this in our interviews. The first question was, what is iltizam for you? We translated it as iltizam. And this is how we came up with our definition of the moral rubrics. Iltizam, religiosity, was defined through the religion, social, and political sectarian dimensions. So to be a multazim would be at the same time following religious rules, being a socially observant person of other codes. So this is this goes across Lebanese groups, and to be sympathetic to the political sectarian dominant group in Dahya, which is Hezbollah. So it was a combination of these three, and it varied according to gender, according to age, generationally. It was a huge difference according to education, class, and we talk about all this in the book. But it's more qualitative, this interpretation in the book, not really quantitative. To go to your questions, yes, in our questionnaire, we asked them a lot about, do you go out? Where do you go out to? Where is it that you prefer going out to? And there were a lot of variation in what they'd like to do. The younger people have a map that is much wider. So they leave Dahya and go to Hamra, go to Verdun, go to Mar Elias, go to downtown sometimes. Ashrafiyya, Monon is singled out, and Gemmaise is singled out, and they don't go there. These are immoral places for most of the time. Downtown, it varies. They go to very specific cafes there, so they go to Petit Café, to Grand Café, and they single out these spaces because they know that they don't serve alcohol, or the ambiance there is convenient to them. But not everyone goes to downtown. And there's a big fear of the other being, and of harassment, not only gender harassment, but political harassment. And in the book, we have a lot of stories about that, about not going out on your own. A guy prefers to go with a friend. So it's, in many ways, a lot of people like to stay in, and like to feel that sense of security and comfort of staying inside, جوا. It's very strong, the جوا. Barra is something else. But again, it depends on, we have some cases of youth who are who have a very wide map, who are very comfortable. And Corniche, of course, Corniche is a major destination. All of Dahya, you hear how people talk about Corniche, it's all Dahya. So Corniche is going to the sea is very important. Yeah, but I'm talking about middle class mostly. Middle class goes to the sea. It doesn't really matter if they can't afford, if it's not a question of affordability. It's a relationship, للبحر. It came very strongly in the interviews.
I have, you only concentrated on cafes. I have a question. Do they have theater or cinemas? And this is where a moral question could come in. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm Nazik Sabayarit.
It's a very sensitive mic. I'm Thanasi Kambanis. Two quick questions. One is related to yours. What community activities or social activities did these cafes disrupt or supplant, or what sort of public sphere existed prior to the advent of the cafes? And second, I'm just curious, what sort of reaction did you get from the people you surveyed and also from the authorities when you came in and started mapping cafes and doing this sort of ethnographic research?
Any other questions? I feel like Oprah.
Not a question, just a comment. I'm working on theater, cinema, dance, so I can answer the question.
Would you like to answer it?
Music,
And introduce yourself, please.
I am one of the felons, you can say. She's my colleague. We met in the Netherlands. We were here colleagues at the AUB before. So I'm also shifted from this, and I'm working on performing arts, meaning music, dance, theater, or revolutionary theater. So I can shed another light on another aspect without being pigeonholed or, yeah. So if you're interested, we can talk. I can tell you about my publications, or you can Google me.
What's your name?
Joseph Laga, sorry. I have 4 books on Amazon.
theaters and cinemas. We didn't work on them, but we worked a little bit on the cultural production by Hezbollah specifically, in terms of music and the museum in Melita, so their understanding of culture as such. There are no cinemas in Dahia. I don't know if Joseph knows of any underground cinemas. So.
Which is like on the border.
Right. Is there a cinema in Beirut Mall? I don't think so. No? No, there's a supermarket in the basement, but no. So, Theater Mbella, but it's the theater that is produced by the association managed by Hezbollah. So it's a very specific theater that it's very much linked to Shia religion.
But there's Imam as well.
And Umam is, Umam is quite different.
Yes, but it's there.
Yes. Umam is the hangar, managed by Luqman Slim and Monica. It's different, but it attracts also. It speaks to culture, but it's a different crowd. I agree. Okay.
Any other questions?
The other question, what was happening before? Before you had like snack-like cafes, not really cafes, but more like the small pastry shops, the small pizza places, the quick coffee spaces. But so where you would grab a coffee and go. It was mostly dominated by males, not females. When we used to do our fieldwork in Dahia, Lara and me, and during our PhD times, we couldn't stay in a cafe and talk about the fieldwork there. So this is a really new addition.
Sidewalk cafes?
At that time, no. This is all new. This is all post-2000, post-1998, 2000. Now you have a very wide supply and very varied supply. You still have the male-dominated cafes, but they're more shabby, more popular, more working class, and more male-oriented. Authorities, they were, I would say, very welcoming. Like, whenever we did our fieldwork, they were very open to that. The topic of culture stirred a lot of debate between us about what's happening, and we talked more to the private entrepreneurs rather than authorities as such, so the owners of the cafe. Now, the owners of the cafes didn't really understand why we were interested in all this. Who cares about the cafe? But they were very welcoming and very, they shared the information with us rather easily, I would say. Young people, they talked also rather fluently with us, rather easily. I would say it was not difficult to do fieldwork, but that was 2007, 2010. Now the accessibility to data collection has changed tremendously from what I hear from people. I'm not going there anymore.
Any other questions? If not, it has been a pleasure, and we're very grateful to Amir Saidi of CAMES and Walid Hassoun, who essentially put the wheels in motion, and to all of you for coming and asking questions. There are books in the back, which I highly recommend you buy. It's, the kind of an academic panel doesn't give a sense of how fluid and wonderfully written the book is. It's actually really fun to read. And there's also a reception, which is upstairs, which all of you are invited to. Please feel free to come if you have questions for or now after. Thank you very much.